Jake Morrison's boots crunched into the snow, the sharp bite of Montana's winter air cutting through his thick woolen jacket. The mountains loomed like silent sentinels around him, an endless stretch of white, broken only by the jagged peaks that seemed to pierce the sky. His breath came out in sharp, misty clouds, the cold creeping into his bones, a constant companion since the first light of dawn. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, but there was no immediate sign of prey. The land was quiet, unnervingly so, as if even the animals had learned to keep their distance from a man who had come to know its dangers all too well. It was moments like this that made Jake feel small, insignificant against the vastness of nature. It had been years since he'd felt anything resembling a connection to the world around him, ever since the death of his wife. The wilderness had become his only companion. The harsh cold, a reminder of the emptiness he carried inside. He hunted, not for sport, but for survival, each kill a grim necessity that brought little satisfaction. And yet, as he trudged through the snow that morning, something unusual caught his eye. A faint shape, barely distinguishable against the white expanse, lay crumpled in the snow. Jake's instincts kicked in, his hunter's eye narrowing. The figure was still, almost too still. He moved closer, the crunch of his boots suddenly loud in the silence. A wolf. A pregnant wolf, her body bent awkwardly at an angle, her breathing shallow and labored. Her fur was matted with blood, the pale white of her coat stained a dark crimson. The sight struck Jake harder than he expected, a strange twinge of empathy swelling in his chest. He paused, rifle still resting on his shoulder, and for a moment he hesitated. The rules of the wild were simple: kill or be killed. A wolf like this in such a condition would be easy prey. It would be an end to her suffering, a swift and silent shot through the heart. But something inside Jake made him linger, the weight of his rifle suddenly unbearable. This wasn't just an animal in distress. It was a life, fragile and fleeting, like the ones he used to care about. He knelt beside her, the cold seeping through his gloves as he gently touched her side. Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with a kind of quiet desperation that made his heart ache. In that moment, Jake knew he couldn't bring himself to end her life. "Easy now," he murmured, as though speaking to a fellow survivor rather than an animal on the brink of death. He had nothing to offer but a fleeting hope, a shared understanding of what it was to fight against the odds. His breath hitched as he carefully slid his arms beneath her, lifting her slight weight with surprising tenderness. As he carried her through the snow, his thoughts swirled, tangled in a way that felt foreign. Why was he doing this? He had no real reason to help her. His days of compassion were long behind him, but there was something about the wolf, something that mirrored the darkness he felt inside himself. He had lost everything once, and now here she was, a reminder of everything he had buried deep. He dragged her toward the small cabin he had built with his own hands, the walls rough-hewn but sturdy. It was far from a home, more a refuge from the unrelenting cold, but it was all he had left. Once inside, he laid her on a bed of straw, her breathing still shallow but steady. He didn't know if she would survive the night, but he had to try. He built a fire, its warmth a small comfort in the vast emptiness of the cabin, and began to tend to her wounds. As the fire crackled, the wolf's eyes began to close, slipping into a fragile, fevered sleep. Jake sat beside her, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He had come to this place seeking solitude, yet in this moment he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he wasn't alone. It wasn't just the wolf. Something else was out there. He stood up abruptly, eyes scanning the darkened landscape outside the small window. His breath caught as a shadow flickered across the snow. A wolf, another one. This one was darker, sleeker, and stood motionless at the edge of the clearing. Jake's heart raced as he watched the creature, its golden eyes catching the faint light of the fire. For a long moment they locked eyes. The air was thick with tension, the stillness suffocating. Then, without a sound, the wolf turned and vanished into the night, leaving Jake with more questions than answers. Had the wolf been watching him? Was this Luna's mate, a creature guarding her from some unspoken threat? Or was something more dangerous drawing closer, creeping through the wilderness, waiting for the right moment to strike? Jake's pulse quickened, but he turned back to the wolf at his feet, the one who had brought him here. She was still breathing, still fighting. For now, that was enough. The storm outside howled louder as the night deepened, but inside the cabin, Jake could only think of the creature lurking in the shadows and the one at his side, the one who, in her final moments, might just change everything he thought he knew about survival. Days passed in a blur of cold winds and quiet nights. Jake kept a steady vigil over Luna, tending to her wounds, watching the way her body slowly began to heal. She was strong, a fighter to the core, even when her strength faltered. Her breathing steadied, and though she still lay curled in the corner of the cabin, her eyes no longer burned with that desperate, hollow look. They had softened, replaced by a quiet trust that Jake hadn't expected to earn. Each morning, Jake would wake to find her watching him, her amber eyes tracking his every movement. It was a strange feeling, having something depend on him. He'd forgotten what it was like to care for another living being, to have someone, or something, look at him as if his actions mattered. It was a stark contrast to the silence that had surrounded him for so long. The snow continued to fall outside, thick and relentless, but inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly. Luna's presence had brought a strange sense of calm to the otherwise barren space. Jake spent hours sitting by her side, talking softly, though he wasn't sure she understood. It didn't matter. There was comfort in the routine, in the simple act of giving care, and Jake began to realize how starved he had been for connection, for something that reminded him of what it meant to live beyond survival. He hunted each day, but never too far from the cabin, always returning with meat for Luna. He would leave her by the fire, lying silently in the straw, before slipping out into the snow. The wild was a harsh, unforgiving place, but in the quiet of those trips, as he tracked elk and deer through the frozen woods, he found solace in the simplicity of it. There was no need to think too hard, no room for questions. There was only the next step, the next decision. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Jake found himself standing at the edge of the clearing, rifle in hand. He had just finished tracking a buck, its scent lingering in the air. He'd taken a shot, but his mind wasn't on the hunt. His thoughts drifted back to Luna, to the wolf who had come into his life when he hadn't asked for it, and yet who had filled a gap inside him he couldn't quite explain. And then he saw it again. A dark figure, Shadow, the second wolf, the one he had spotted days before, lurking just out of reach, watching from the trees. This time the wolf didn't stay hidden in the distance. It moved closer, closer than it had before. Jake's heart beat faster as he lowered his rifle, unsure whether to raise it again or let the wolf approach. The two of them stood there for a long while, man and wolf, locked in a standoff of sorts. There was no growl, no aggressive stance from Shadow. It simply watched Jake, as if waiting for something, perhaps a signal. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a knowing that unsettled Jake. He had seen it before, in animals that had lived too long in the wild, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't shake. Finally, the wolf took a step forward, and Jake instinctively reached for the rifle again, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the trigger. But something made him stop. The stillness in the air, the quiet understanding that passed between them, felt too important to break. The wolf's eyes flicked toward the cabin and then back to Jake, as if it was making some silent assessment. The air between them seemed to thrum with an unspoken question. The wolf wasn't here for a fight, or so it seemed. It was here for something else. And for the first time, Jake felt the weight of his own choices, the consequences of what he had done. Was he really helping Luna? Or was he about to draw another predator closer, inviting danger into his world without fully understanding the stakes? The decision came quickly. Before Jake could second-guess himself, the wolf turned and disappeared into the trees once more, vanishing as silently as it had come. Jake stood still for a long time, rifle hanging loosely in his grip. His breath misted the cold air, his mind spinning. He wanted to believe that the wolves would go their separate way, that Luna would heal and be free. But deep down, Jake knew that wasn't how this story would play out. Shadow wasn't just a rogue wolf. He was a part of something larger. A pack, perhaps. And packs were never easy to ignore in the wilderness. When Jake returned to the cabin, the flicker of the fire greeted him. Luna lay in the corner, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. She didn't look up at him as he entered, but there was a soft sense of peace about her now. It was as if she had already accepted what was happening, or perhaps had always known. Jake sat down beside her, rubbing a hand over the coarse fur of her side. "You've got a lot to teach me, don't you?" he murmured softly, though he wasn't sure if she could understand. Still, something in him, something long buried, responded to the quiet bond they had formed. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin, Jake didn't feel quite so alone. As night fell and the fire burned lower, Jake's thoughts turned again to Shadow. The wolf had been close. Too close. There was a part of him that wondered if it was only a matter of time before he would have to face the consequences of his choices. But for now, the wolf was gone, and Luna was safe, or so he hoped. The days grew shorter, the light of afternoon fading early as the long winter stretched on. Montana's Rocky Mountains were harsh in their beauty, crisp white snow draping the land, untouched for miles except for the tracks Jake left behind. But within the quiet of the wilderness, a storm was brewing, one that Jake had not anticipated. It was the hunters who brought it. Word travels fast in the small town, and rumors spread like wildfire. A pack of wolves had been spotted in the area, and they weren't just hunting for food, they were killing livestock. Sheep, cattle, whatever they could get their jaws on. The locals were angry, and the hunters, eager for a challenge, were gathering in numbers. Jake had heard the whispers on his rare trips to town. He'd seen the worried looks on the faces of the townsfolk, their fear palpable. People spoke in low tones, too scared to speak outright, but equally determined to find a solution. The wolves had become a threat, and to some there was no choice but to eliminate it. Nature's balance was shifting, and they feared what might come next. Jake didn't concern himself with town matters anymore, but as the days went by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, something was drawing closer. Luna, still recovering, seemed restless. She would pace the small cabin in circles, her eyes darting toward the door, as if she sensed what was on the horizon. Even Shadow, whom Jake had glimpsed only from a distance, was more present now. The wolf watched the cabin from the tree line during the daylight hours, its eyes always on Jake, always on Luna. Jake couldn't deny the connection. He wasn't foolish enough to think the wolves were here to befriend him, but there was something undeniable about the way they circled his life, something deeper than just hunger, something that felt like instinct. One morning, as Jake prepared to head out on another hunt, a voice reached him from outside. A knock at the door, followed by the muffled sound of boots crunching on the snow. He opened it, surprised to find two of the local hunters standing on his doorstep, rifles slung across their shoulders and grim expressions on their faces. "We need your help, Morrison," said the older of the two men, Roy Jenkins. He was a seasoned hunter, a man whose face was carved with years of hard living. "There's a pack out there, and they're taking everything they can. You seen anything?" Jake didn't answer right away. He knew what they were really asking. The rumors about the wolves were true. The hunters had been assembling, and now they were coming for Luna. They needed his confirmation. They needed him to admit what he knew so they could justify the hunt. But Jake wasn't about to betray Luna, not after everything he'd done to help her. He glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes flicking to the cabin where Luna rested. There was a flicker of movement outside, the silhouette of Shadow watching from the tree line. The wolf was close, but Jake felt no fear. There was only a growing sense of protectiveness, a strange bond that tethered him to the creatures of the wild in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I haven't seen any wolves," Jake said carefully, his voice low, measured. "Maybe you're mistaken. The wild is a big place." Roy's eyes narrowed. "You know something, Jake. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The second hunter, A younger man named Ben stepped forward. "We've got orders to clear them out. If they're a threat, we'll take care of it." His tone was hard, but there was a hint of uncertainty beneath the bravado. Jake stared at them for a long moment. The weight of the decision hung heavy on his chest. If he gave them anything, even a hint that Luna and Shadow were nearby, the wolves would be hunted down without hesitation. He couldn't let that happen. "I'm telling you," Jake said more firmly this time, "there's no pack. You're chasing shadows." Ben hesitated, but Roy seemed less convinced. He gave Jake a sharp look before turning back toward the snowy expanse, his boots crunching on the frost as he walked away. "We'll see about that," Roy muttered, before they both disappeared into the wilderness. Jake watched them go, his heart thudding in his chest. The hunters were relentless, and now they were looking for a reason to act. He knew the coming days would bring danger, not just to Luna and Shadow, but to him as well. He stood there, his breath hanging in the cold air, a storm of uncertainty brewing in his mind. He'd been alone for so long, isolated in this cabin with only the wolves for company. He had thought he was safe, that he could control the world around him, but that illusion was shattering. When he turned to go back inside, his gaze caught the dark shape of Shadow once more, moving through the trees, closer now. Jake's pulse quickened. The wolf had been watching, waiting, and it was clear. Luna wasn't the only one with something to protect. Jake's eyes narrowed as he stepped toward the cabin. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let anyone harm these creatures. Not now. Not after everything he had done to keep them safe. He would protect them, no matter what it took. The days passed in a heavy, tense silence. The storm of whispers in town grew louder, and the threat of the hunters drew nearer. Jake could feel it in the air, a weight pressing down on him, suffocating the quiet that had once been his refuge. It wasn't just the weather that was closing in, it was the people, and their guns, and their certainty that the wolves needed to be eradicated. Jake didn't know how much longer he could keep this fragile balance intact. He had done his best to keep Luna and Shadow hidden, to protect them from the hunters. But as the days grew colder, the wind carrying the scent of danger, he knew the time for hiding was running out. The night the hunters arrived, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin walls. Jake sat by the fire, his eyes flicking to the door every few moments. Luna had been restless all evening, pacing the floor, her ears twitching at every sound. Even Shadow, who had kept his distance, seemed uneasy. He could feel the tension, a low hum in the air that warned him something was coming. It wasn't long before he heard it, the crunch of boots on the snow, the sharp crack of branches snapping underfoot. They were here, the hunters. Jake's breath hitched, and he moved quickly to secure the cabin, locking the door behind him. His heart hammered in his chest, but there was no time for fear, no time for hesitation. He had made his choice, and now he had to see it through. Luna's eyes met his as he moved around the room, setting up the makeshift barricades he had prepared. There was a quiet understanding between them, no words, just a silent bond that spoke of trust, of survival. She would fight if it came to that, he knew. She had fought for her life already, and now she would fight to protect what was hers. The sound of the hunters' voices drifted in through the cracks in the cabin's walls, muffled but unmistakable. They were close, too close. Jake grabbed his rifle and slung it over his shoulder, his gaze flicking once more to the door. Luna stood at the edge of the firelight watching him, her eyes unwavering. "You stay here," Jake whispered, his voice low but firm. "I'll keep them away. Just stay safe." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they meant little. He couldn't keep Luna hidden forever, and if they found her, they would take her. He wouldn't let that happen, not on his watch. The door creaked open, the wind carrying the bitter chill into the cabin. 3 hunters stood in the threshold, rifles raised and eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Jake's pulse surged as he stared them down. The leader, Roy, was at the front, his eyes cold and determined. "There's nowhere to run, Morrison," Roy said, his voice steady but laced with malice. "We know you've been hiding them." Jake didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his fingers tightening on the rifle. "You don't know anything," he said, his voice low but full of quiet defiance. The men stepped inside, their boots crunching on the wooden floor. Ben, the younger one, glanced around nervously, his eyes flicking to the corner where Luna lay. "Where is it?" Ben asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Where's the wolf?" Jake's heart pounded. His mind raced, calculating. If they knew where Luna was, if they found her now, it was over. There would be no saving her. Luna let out a low growl, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to echo through the room. The men froze, turning toward the corner where she lay, her amber eyes gleaming in the low firelight. Before they could make another move, Shadow appeared in the doorway, his sleek form blocking the hunter's path. He stepped into the cabin like a shadow come to life, his eyes locked onto Roy's with a cold, unwavering stare. "Stay back," Jake warned, raising his rifle, though his hand shook slightly. "You don't want to do this." Roy hesitated, his eyes flicking between Jake and the wolf. He knew the danger, but he was a man driven by fear, by the need to control the wilderness that had always eluded him. "We'll deal with them now," Roy muttered, raising his rifle. Jake didn't hesitate. In an instant he stepped forward, using his body to shield Luna and Shadow from the hunters. "No," he said firmly. "You don't understand. These wolves are part of this land. You don't have the right to take them." For a long moment, everything was still. The crackling fire was the only sound in the room, the tension so thick that it could be cut with a knife. Then Roy spoke, his voice quieter, but no less dangerous. "You've made your choice, Morrison." Without warning, he raised his rifle. Time seemed to slow as Jake moved. He ducked low, dodging the blast, and in a flash he was on top of Roy, his hands locking around the man's wrist, twisting the rifle from his grip. The two of them grappled, the force of their struggle knocking over the furniture, sending wood splintering across the floor. Ben and the other hunter hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to intervene, but Shadow let out a bone-chilling growl that made their feet freeze to the floor. "Stay back," Jake grunted, breath coming fast. He wrenched Roy's rifle from his hands and tossed it aside, shoving the man back. For a second, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Jake was winded, his muscles aching from the fight, but there was something deeper at play now. The hunters weren't just after the wolves, they were after control of something that couldn't be controlled. The silence stretched long and heavy before Jake finally spoke, his voice low but resolute. "Leave, now." Roy glared at him, his chest heaving with anger and fear, but he didn't make another move. After a long, tense moment, he signaled for the others to follow. Without another word, they turned and retreated, disappearing into the night. Jake watched them go, his heart still racing. The wolves, the wild, they had won this round. But he knew it wouldn't end here. It never did. Inside, Luna and Shadow stayed where they were, the bond between them unspoken but undeniable. Jake exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He had protected them, for now, but he knew that the real test was still to come. The days that followed the hunter's departure were heavy with a quiet sort of relief. Jake had won the immediate battle, but he knew that it was only a temporary victory. The wolves were still out there, still vulnerable to the men who roamed these mountains with their rifles and their fear of what they couldn't control. But for now, in the stillness of the cabin, the threat had passed. The cold winter air no longer felt quite so suffocating, and the silence seemed to settle around him like a blanket. Luna was doing well. Her wounds had healed, and her strength had returned. She moved with a grace Jake hadn't seen before, her muscles rippling beneath her thick coat as she paced the cabin, her eyes always watching. But there was a restlessness in her now, a shift in her behavior that Jake couldn't ignore. She was ready to return to the wild. He could feel it in the way she no longer stayed close to him, as she once had, the way she seemed to sense the world beyond the walls of the cabin, the mountains waiting for her. Shadow had been close, always near but distant, always at the edge of the trees, always watching. Jake could feel the pull between them, an unspoken understanding that they were bound by something larger than their fleeting time together. The wolves had claimed the land as their own, and Jake was no longer the intruder. He had come to see the wilderness differently, to see it through their eyes, and now it was time to let them go. On the morning that Luna's eyes gleamed with a quiet certainty, Jake knew it was time. He stood by the window, watching the snow fall in soft sheets, his breath fogging the glass. His hand rested on the rifle slung over his shoulder, but he no longer felt the need to carry it as he once had. There was no hunt today, no threats to defend against. Today he was only a witness. He walked outside, the crunch of his boots on the snow a familiar sound, but the air felt different today, charged, almost electric. Luna appeared from the shadows, her eyes locking onto his. She was beautiful, untamed and free, a creature that belonged to the mountains, not to him. Jake crouched down slowly, his hand reaching out to her. Luna's eyes flicked to his, and for a moment they held each other's gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. She stepped forward, nuzzling his hand with her snout. It was a brief touch, but it was enough. It was her way of telling him goodbye. Shadow appeared then, moving silently from the tree line, his dark coat blending seamlessly with the night. He stood a few feet away, his eyes narrowing in the dim light, but there was no aggression. There was only acknowledgement. The two wolves, together again. Jake took a deep breath, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. His eyes lingered on Luna for a long moment, then shifted to Shadow. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. This was the end of something, an end to their brief time together, an end to the man he had been before the wolves had changed him. He wasn't the same man who had first found Luna on the brink of death. He was something different now, something better. "I won't forget you," Jake whispered, his voice rough. "I'll never forget what you taught me." Luna gave one last glance back at him, her eyes filled with a depth of emotion that words could never capture. She didn't need to say anything. Her departure was her answer. Slowly she turned, her graceful movements carrying her into the trees. Shadow followed, his gaze lingering on Jake for just a moment before he too disappeared into the wild. Jake stood there, alone in the quiet of the mountains. The air was still, the snow falling softly, and the world seemed to hold its breath as the wolves vanished into the wilderness. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that, in some way, they would always be with him. The wolves had reminded him of something he had lost long ago, a connection to the earth, to the wild, to the rawness of life. They had changed him, had reminded him of what it meant to live outside of survival, to live with purpose. As the last shadows of the wolves faded into the forest, Jake turned away from the spot where they had stood. He felt lighter now, not burdened by the weight of isolation or the fear of what he couldn't control. He had learned to respect the wild, to understand the delicate balance between predator and prey, and most importantly, to let go when it was time. The wilderness would continue to thrive, with or without him, and that, in itself, was enough. Months later, as Jake stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the vast expanse of mountains, the world seemed to hum with life. The snow had begun to melt, the promise of spring lingering in the air. He heard a distant howl, soft and haunting, carried on the wind. It was the call of the wolves, far away but always present in his heart. Jake smiled, a peaceful look settling over his face. He had done what he needed to do, and the wilderness would go on. He wasn't alone anymore, not truly. The wolves had shown him that, and now he could rest easy knowing that the wild in all its raw beauty would continue to thrive.